The cathedral doors part just as the priest asks if anyone objects. Nobody was supposed to answer that question tonight. Certainly not like this. Luciana walks in first, and the room simply stops breathing. Emerald silk clings to her spine, gold thread catching candlelight with every step, her curls falling loose and unbothered down a back that the whole congregation can suddenly see far too much of. She is not hiding. She was never going to hide again. Beside her, a hand closes around hers, broad, tattooed, unmistakably in charge. Salvatore doesn't rush. Men like him never do. Silver hair, a jaw carved from patience and violence in equal measure, he walks her up that aisle like he owns the building, the guest list, and the air everyone in it is currently forgetting to breathe. At the altar, Julian turns first. His bride, Alessandra, turns second, veil trembling, crown catching the light like it's suddenly too heavy for her. Julian's mouth opened and nothing came out. 6 months ago, he told Luciana she wasn't ambitious enough to matter in his world. Tonight, she's married to the man who built it. And somewhere behind that carefully composed smile of hers, Luciana is doing the math on exactly how long it's going to take to burn Julian's new kingdom to the ground, with him still standing inside it. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video. It only takes a moment, and it helps us reach more story lovers like you. Where in the world are you listening from? Tell us in the comments. We love to see how far our stories travels. Now back to the story. 6 months before that cathedral aisle turned into her runway, Luciana was still the woman who believed loyalty meant something. She was sitting across from Julian at a restaurant she'd chosen because it mattered to him once, back when he used to talk about their future like it was a plan and not a performance. The tablecloth was white, his face was not calm. He'd been rehearsing something on the drive over, she could tell, the way his jaw kept working before any words came out. "We need to talk," he said. Luciana set her glass down slowly. "That's usually how it starts." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Notice that you've been rehearsing your exit speech since we sat down?" Julian exhaled through his nose, the kind of sound men make when they want credit for patience they don't actually have. He reached for his water instead of her hand, which told her more than anything he was about to say. "I've been offered something," he said. "Something real. The kind of opportunity that doesn't repeat itself." "Congratulations." Her voice stayed even. "What does that have to do with us?" "Everything." He finally looked at her properly, and for a second she almost recognized the man she'd fallen for 2 years earlier, before ambition had hollowed out whatever used to live behind his eyes. "Alessandra's father runs half the ports on this coast, Luciana. Half. You understand what that means for a man like me trying to build something." "A man like you," she repeated. "You mean a man engaged to someone else." "I mean a man who can't afford to stay small forever." He said it like an apology and a boast at the same time, which was somehow worse than if he'd just been cruel about it. "You're brilliant, you know that. You'd have made a wonderful partner in another life. But love doesn't build empires. Strategic families do." There it was, not even dressed up. Luciana let the silence stretch long enough that the waiter refilling water at the next table finished and left before she spoke again. "So, this is a business decision. Don't make it sound ugly." "I'm not making it sound like anything, Julian. I'm just naming it correctly." She folded her napkin with a precision that had nothing to do with the fabric and everything to do with keeping her hands from shaking. "You're trading 2 years of my life for a shipping empire." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. You just said it yourself." She leaned back, studying him the way she'd studied contracts before signing them, looking for the clause that would eventually cost her everything. "How long have you known her?" "That's not relevant." "It's entirely relevant. How long?" Julian's silence answered before his mouth did. 3 months, maybe 4, judging by the way his eyes slid to the side instead of meeting hers. Long enough to have made a decision. Long enough to have kept coming to dinner with Luciana anyway, kissing her goodnight, letting her plan a wedding that apparently existed only in her own head. "You knew for months," she said quietly, "and you let me keep talking about venues." "I didn't know how to tell you. You just told me. It took you 4 sentences and you didn't even struggle." He had the decency to flinch at that, at least. Small mercy. Not enough of one. Alessandra's father is Don Enrico Vasquez, Julian continued, and there was something almost eager in the way he said the name now, like saying it out loud made the whole betrayal feel more legitimate. You know what that family controls. My father built something significant, sure, but Enrico's reach goes places ours never has. This marriage puts me 2 steps from running operations that would take me a decade to build alone, maybe longer. So your father's empire wasn't enough for you. My father's empire isn't even mine yet, and it might never be, not the way things are going. Something bitter crossed his face then, quick and real, the first honest thing he'd said all evening. He barely speaks to me as it is, thinks I'm soft, thinks I don't have what it takes to hold what he's built. And you think marrying into another syndicate proves him wrong? I think marrying into another syndicate means I won't need him to be right about anything. Luciana studied him for a long moment, and something in her chest that had been aching all evening went very still, very cold, the way water does right before it turns to ice. She wasn't going to cry in this restaurant. She'd decided that before she even sat down, back when she noticed he'd chosen a corner table where no one important would see them. You're not doing this for power, she said slowly. You're doing this because you're afraid of your own father. That's not. It's exactly that. You can't earn his respect building something yourself, so you're marrying your way into looking respectable instead. She almost laughed, except nothing about this was funny. That's not ambition, Julian. That's hiding with better tailoring. His face darkened. You don't get to psychoanalyze me on your way out the door. I'm not on my way out. You pushed me. Semantics. No. Accuracy. There's a difference, and apparently it's one you've never learned. She stood, smoothing her dress, refusing to let her hands tremble even though everything underneath her skin was screaming. Tell me something. Does Alessandra know you're only interested in her father's shipping lanes, or does she think this is a love story too? Julian's silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. Luciana reached for her coat, and the finality of the motion seemed to unsettle him more than anything she'd said. You know what the strange part is? I actually believed in you. I thought you wanted to build something real, something that was yours. Turns out you just wanted a shortcut with a veil on it. You're being dramatic. I'm being accurate again. It seems to be a theme tonight. She walked out before he could find a response, and to his credit, or perhaps his cowardice, he didn't follow her into the parking lot to argue further. Some men know when they've already lost the only leverage they had. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every red light an insult, every familiar street suddenly foreign, like the city itself had rearranged overnight to remind her nothing was permanent. Luciana didn't cry. Not then, not really, but her hand stayed tight around the wheel the entire way, knuckles pale, jaw locked. She'd given him 2 years, introductions to people who mattered, late nights helping him prepare for meetings he was too nervous to walk into alone. She'd believed, foolishly and completely, that loyalty was a currency that meant something to him too. Instead, she was a placeholder, a stepping stone he'd used until something more useful walked past. By the time she got home, the sadness had curdled into something sharper, something with edges. She sat at her kitchen table with a single glass of wine she never actually drank, staring at the wall, replaying every word of that conversation until it stopped hurting and started clarifying. Julian wanted power he hadn't earned. Fine. Julian was terrified of his own father's judgment. Also fine, and frankly, useful information. Because if Julian couldn't secure his father's respect, if the great Salvatore genuinely thought his own son was too soft to inherit what he'd spent a lifetime building, then Julian's marriage into the Vasquez family wasn't a triumph at all. It was a man running from a problem he'd never solved. Luciana had spent the last 2 years learning how syndicate families operated, absorbing details Julian mentioned in passing, filing away names and rivalries and old grudges the way other people collected recipes. She knew Salvatore's reputation. Ruthless. Brilliant. A man who'd taken a modest inheritance and turned it into something that stretched across 3 states, mostly by outthinking men who assumed brute force was the only currency that mattered in his world. A man who, according to every rumor she'd ever heard, respected exactly one thing above loyalty: competence. She sat with that thought until it stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like a plan. Julian thought he'd traded up, thought marrying into money and muscle solved the problem of his father's disappointment forever. But Luciana knew something Julian never had the patience to learn about his own father, something she'd picked up in fragments over dinners and offhand comments, and the particular way Julian's shoulders tensed whenever Salvatore's name came up. Salvatore wasn't looking for a son who married well. He was looking for an heir who could actually run something. And if Julian wasn't going to be that person, someone eventually would be. Luciana finally reached for her wine and drank it in one long, steady pull, feeling the warmth settle where the cold had been sitting all evening. She had 2 years of intelligence on this family that Julian had handed her without ever realizing its value. She had a mind Julian had once called brilliant, right before deciding brilliant wasn't the same as useful, and she had exactly nothing left to lose, which, in her limited experience of powerful men, tended to be the single most dangerous position a woman could occupy. Somewhere across the city, Julian was probably already calling Alessandra, already congratulating himself on an escape well executed. He had no idea he'd just handed Luciana the one piece of information that would end with her wearing his mother's old title before the year was out. She picked up her phone and began making a list. Not of grievances, of names. The first one on it belonged to a man Julian was too afraid to even schedule a proper meeting with: his own father. Getting an audience with Salvatore turned out to be harder than Luciana expected, and she'd expected it to be nearly impossible. 3 phone calls to his office went nowhere, filtered through assistants trained to say no politely and repeatedly. A 4th attempt, routed through a mutual acquaintance from Julian's old circle, earned her nothing but a warning that the man didn't take unsolicited meetings, especially not from women connected to his son's romantic history. So she stopped asking politely. Luciana spent a week doing what she did best, which was research nobody asked her to do until it became impossible to ignore. She pulled together everything Julian had ever mentioned about the syndicate's shipping contracts, cross-referenced it with public filings that told a much messier story than the official numbers suggested, and found the seams Julian hadn't even realized he'd shown her. Discrepancies in freight manifests. A subsidiary company registered 8 months ago that didn't appear anywhere in the family's official structure. Money moving in directions that made sense only if someone inside the organization was quietly building an exit, or an ambush. She was fairly certain which one. On the following Tuesday, she drove to the private dock where Salvatore kept his primary shipping office, the one Julian used to complain about visiting because his father made him stand the entire meeting instead of offering a chair. She didn't call ahead this time. She simply walked through the front gate like she belonged there, carrying a leather folder and an expression that dared anyone to stop her. Someone did, obviously. 2 someones, both built like door frames. "You can't be here," the taller one said, stepping into her path. "I have information your boss needs to see before his son bankrupts everything he's built," Luciana said, not breaking stride, not raising her voice either. "You can either walk me in, or you can explain to him tomorrow why you turned away the woman holding proof of an internal betrayal." The 2 men exchanged a look. Luciana had learned, over the years, that confidence often mattered more than permission, especially with men whose entire job was assessing threats. "Wait here," the shorter one said finally, and disappeared through a side door. 5 minutes later, she was standing in an office that smelled like cedar and old money, facing a man whose reputation had clearly undersold him. Salvatore was seated behind a desk that looked older than she was, silver hair immaculate, eyes doing the kind of slow, unhurried assessment that made most people fidget. Luciana did not fidget. She'd decided that in the car on the way over, and she intended to keep that promise to herself no matter how unsettling his stare turned out to be. "You're the girl my son discarded," Salvatore said, not a question. "I'm the woman your son underestimated," Luciana replied. "There's a difference, and I think you'll agree once you see what I brought." Something flickered across his expression. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Luciana counted it as progress. "You have 5 minutes," he said. Use them well. She didn't waste a second of it. She opened the folder and laid the documents across his desk with the same steady precision she'd have used presenting to a board of investors, because in every way that mattered, that's exactly what this was. Your son has been quietly diverting freight contracts through a shell company registered 8 months ago, she said. It routes through 3 intermediaries before it ever touches your books, which I assume is intentional, because the profit margins on those contracts are nearly double what your official shipping division reports. Salvatore's eyes moved across the page slowly, and whatever amusement had been there a moment earlier was gone entirely now. Where did you get this? Julian talks more than he realizes when he thinks no one's paying attention. I was paying attention for 2 years. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. He's not just skimming profit, though. Look at the 3rd page. Salvatore turned to it. His jaw tightened. The Vasquez family, he said quietly. Your son's new father-in-law owns 40% of that shell company, Luciana confirmed. Which means every contract Julian diverts isn't just lining his own pocket. It's funding Enrico Vasquez's expansion into territory that currently belongs to you. Julian isn't marrying into power, Mr. Salvatore. He's financing his own replacement of you, using your own shipping lanes to do it. The silence that followed was long enough that Luciana genuinely wasn't sure which way it would break. Why bring this to me? Salvatore finally asked, instead of using it to ruin him out of spite. You'd have every right. Because spite doesn't build anything. Luciana met his eyes without flinching. I could leak this to a rival family and watch your entire operation implode from the inside. And honestly, a smaller version of me wanted exactly that for about 4 days. But that's not a plan. That's just revenge with extra steps. And revenge alone has never built an empire that lasted. So what is your plan? Your organization has spent 2 generations existing in the shadows. Profitable, but perpetually vulnerable. Always one indictment away from collapse. I've spent the last week looking at your legitimate holdings versus what's still operating outside the law, and there's an opportunity here that has nothing to do with your son's betrayal. She pulled a second document from the folder, a rough outline she'd stayed up 2 nights building. You have real estate, shipping infrastructure, logistics networks. All of it could be restructured into something that generates the same revenue, maybe more, entirely within legal frameworks. It would take the right person to manage that transition, someone who understands both worlds. Salvatore studied her for a long moment, and this time the assessment felt different, sharper, like he was recalculating something. You're proposing to legitimize a criminal syndicate, he said slowly. I'm proposing to protect an empire from a son who's already selling pieces of it to your rivals, Luciana corrected. The legitimization is simply the smartest long-term move available to you. Both problems happen to have the same solution. And what do you get out of this? There it was, the question she'd been waiting for. Julian humiliated me publicly and used 2 years of my life as a stepping stone, she said plainly. I'm not interested in crying about it. I'm interested in making sure he understands, in a very permanent way, exactly what he threw away. Salvatore leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and for the first time since she'd walked in, something that resembled genuine respect crossed his face. You understand what you're suggesting, he said. This isn't a business partnership you're describing. This is a takeover of my son's inheritance. Your son already tried to take over yours, Luciana said. I'm simply offering you a better option than watching him succeed. Another silence, shorter this time. Most people who walk into this office asking for something want money, Salvatore said. You haven't asked for a single dollar. Money isn't what I'm after. Then what exactly are you after, miss? Luciana? She held his gaze steadily. And what I'm after is a seat at the table where decisions actually get made. Not as a favor, as someone who's earned it by handing you the one piece of information that could have destroyed everything you've built, before it had the chance to. Salvatore studied the documents on his desk again, then studied her, and something in his expression shifted into calculation, the specific kind reserved for opportunities too valuable to dismiss out of pride. I'll need to verify all of this, he said finally. I'd expect nothing less from a man who survived this long. If it checks out, he continued, you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about what a seat at that table actually looks like. Luciana allowed herself the smallest smile, the first genuine one in over a week. I look forward to it, Mr. Salvatore. Call me Salvatore, he said, standing, extending a hand that carried the weight of a man used to people flinching from his grip. If half of what you've shown me holds up, Miss Luciana, you may have just done me a far greater service than you realize. She shook his hand without hesitation, without flinching, meeting the pressure of his grip with her own. I know exactly what service I've done you, she said. That's precisely why I'm standing here, instead of selling this to someone who'd use it to burn your entire family to the ground. Salvatore's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with something closer to genuine curiosity, the look of a man who hadn't been surprised by anyone in a very long time, and wasn't entirely sure how to categorize the feeling now that it had arrived. 3 days, he said. I'll verify everything, and then we'll talk terms. I'll be waiting, Luciana said, already turning toward the door, already feeling the shift in the air behind her, the sense that something enormous had just been set into motion. Julian had spent 2 years treating her like a placeholder in his story. He was about to discover exactly how large a mistake that had been. 3 days felt considerably longer when Luciana had nothing to do but wait for a verdict. She spent the time productively, or at least she told herself that, refining the restructuring proposal she'd sketched for Salvatore, tightening the logic, anticipating every objection a man who'd spent 30 years operating outside the law might raise against operating inside it. She didn't hear from him on day 1. She didn't hear from him on day 2 either, and by the evening of day 2, she'd started to wonder if she'd overplayed her hand. If a man like Salvatore simply absorbed useful information from strangers and discarded the strangers along with it. The call came on the morning of day 3, brief and to the point. Come to the estate, said a voice she didn't recognize. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Come alone. She didn't ask questions. She simply confirmed and hung up, and spent the rest of the day trying not to imagine every possible way that meeting could go wrong. The Salvatore estate sat behind gates that probably cost more than most people's houses, a sprawling property with the kind of understated grandeur that whispered rather than announced. A man met her at the door, wordlessly leading her through a hallway lined with art that looked older than the country itself, until they reached a study where Salvatore sat waiting with a glass of something amber in his hand. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Luciana sat, spine straight, hands folded, refusing to let the grandeur of the room intimidate her the way it was clearly designed to intimidate everyone who entered it. Everything checked out, Salvatore said without preamble. Every document, every name, every dollar. My son has been quietly funneling contracts to Enrico Vasquez for nearly a year, long before the engagement was even announced. This wasn't romance that turned into ambition. It was ambition wearing romance as a disguise from the very beginning. I suspected as much, Luciana said. Julian isn't a subtle man, even when he thinks he is. Salvatore's mouth twitched, something almost like amusement crossing his weathered features. No, he never has been. His mother used to say he inherited my ambition without my patience. I'm beginning to understand what she meant. I'm sorry, Luciana said, and meant it, because whatever Julian had become, there was still a version of grief in watching a parent recognize their child's failures so plainly. Don't be. Salvatore set his glass down. I've spent years hoping he'd grow into something he was never built to be. Your information simply confirmed what I already feared. What matters now is what we do with it. You said we'd discuss terms. I did. He studied her for a long moment, the same assessing look from 3 days earlier, except sharper now, more deliberate. Tell me something, Luciana. What do you know about how organizations like mine actually survive? Loyalty, she said, or the illusion of it, propped up by fear and shared profit. Partially correct. He leaned forward. Organizations like mine survive on succession. Every enemy I've ever buried didn't fall because I outfought them. They fell because their own house collapsed from within, because sons turned on fathers, because brothers turned on brothers, because nobody had built anything strong enough to survive the transition to the next generation. I've spent 30 years building an empire, and I've spent the last several years terrified that Julian would be the reason it doesn't survive me. And now you know he's already trying to accelerate that collapse. Now I know it, Salvatore agreed grimly, which leaves me with a problem. If I simply cut Julian off, disown him publicly, Vasquez will still have leverage through Alessandra's marriage, and half my own organization will see it as weakness. An old man, unable to control his own bloodline. Weakness gets you killed in this business far faster than betrayal does. So you need a solution that looks like strength. I need an heir who understands both the world I built and the world I'm trying to build it into, Salvatore said, watching her closely now. Someone with intelligence sharp enough to outmaneuver men who've spent decades in this life, and nerve steady enough to walk into a stranger's office and hand him evidence that could have gotten her killed if I'd been a different kind of man. Luciana felt something shift in the air, a recalculation she hadn't quite anticipated. "You're not talking about a business partnership anymore," she said slowly. "No," Salvatore agreed. "I'm not. Say it plainly. I don't respond well to riddles, even elegant ones." Something like respect flickered across his face at that, quick and genuine. "Marry me, Luciana." The room went very quiet. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me correctly." Salvatore's voice remained steady, businesslike, the tone of a man proposing a merger rather than a marriage, which, in fairness, was precisely what this was. A blood-bound union, formal, public, undeniable. It solves several problems simultaneously. It removes any question of Julian's legitimacy as heir apparent, because the moment I take a wife, any children we might have supersede his claim entirely, regardless of whether we ever intend to have them. It signals to every family watching that I remain firmly in control of my own house, and it gives you the exact seat at the table you walked in here asking for 3 days ago, except considerably higher up that table than either of us initially imagined. Luciana sat with that for a long moment, her mind working through the implications faster than she could organize them into words. "You barely know me," she finally said. "I know you walked past 2 of my men without flinching," Salvatore said. "I know you spent 2 years quietly gathering intelligence on a family you had every reason to resent, and instead of using it for petty revenge, you built a strategy sophisticated enough to impress a man who survived 4 assassination attempts and outlived 3 rival dons. I know exactly what kind of woman does that, Luciana, and it isn't the kind of woman who needs charm or romance to prove her worth. It's the kind of woman who understands power, which is precisely the kind of woman this family needs sitting beside me. This isn't a proposal born of affection." "No," he agreed without hesitation. "It's a proposal born of necessity, and I'd insult you by pretending otherwise, but I won't insult you either by suggesting affection couldn't grow from mutual respect, given time. I've seen stranger things happen in this life than 2 capable people building something real out of an arrangement that started as strategy." Luciana thought of Julian, of 2 years spent believing love alone could build a future, only to watch that belief dissolve into a restaurant conversation that lasted less than 15 minutes. She thought about what it meant that this man, this dangerous, formidable stranger, was offering her something Julian never had, which was honesty about exactly what this arrangement would and wouldn't be. "What happens to Julian," she asked, "if I agree to this?" "He remains my son," Salvatore said. "That doesn't change. But his path to inheriting anything meaningful ends the moment I marry you, and he'll understand exactly why, because he'll understand precisely who handed me the information that made this decision necessary in the first place. He'll hate me for it." "He already discarded you," Salvatore said simply. "I'd say that particular concern arrived several months too late to matter." Luciana almost laughed at that, surprised by how much the bluntness of it settled something restless in her chest. "And Alessandra," she continued, "Vasquez's daughter. What happens to their wedding, their alliance?" "Their wedding proceeds exactly as planned," Salvatore said, and something sharp entered his expression now, something that looked distinctly like satisfaction. "Julian wanted a grand cathedral ceremony to announce his rise into power. I intend to let him have it, We'll simply make sure the entire underworld understands, in that exact moment, precisely whose power actually matters. You want to crash his wedding. I want to walk into that cathedral with my wife on my arm, Salvatore corrected, and let every family watching understand that whatever Julian believes he's building with the Vasquez alliance, it will always exist beneath something considerably larger, something you and I will have built together. Luciana studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against everything she'd lost, everything she'd planned for in the 2 years she'd spent building a life with a man who ultimately saw her as disposable. This is a business arrangement, she said finally, needing to hear it stated plainly one more time. It's a business arrangement with a marriage certificate attached, Salvatore confirmed. Nothing more than that, unless you decide, in time, that you'd like it to become something more. I won't pressure you either direction. I've built enough in this life to know that the strongest alliances are the ones neither party is forced into. And if I say no, then I thank you for the information you brought me, I compensate you generously for the risk you took delivering it, and you walk out of here with my genuine respect. Nothing more required of you. He held her gaze steadily. I don't operate through coercion, Luciana. I've found it produces weak allies and weaker outcomes. I'd rather you choose this because you understand exactly what we could build, not because you feel cornered into agreeing. Luciana sat in the silence that followed, turning the offer over from every angle she could manage, thinking of Julian's face if she walked into that cathedral on his father's arm, thinking of every dismissive comment he'd made about her ambition not being enough to matter in his world. Say the vow requirement again, she said. Bloodbound. What does that actually mean in your world? It means formal, public, and irreversible, Salvatore said. No annulment quietly arranged 6 months later. Once we do this, it's done, recognized by every family with enough power to matter. It protects us both, and frankly, it removes any temptation either of us might have to treat this as anything less than serious. Luciana thought of the list she'd started the night Julian left her sitting alone with a glass of wine she never drank, the first name on it belonging to the very man sitting across from her now. All right, she said finally, steady, certain, the decision settling into place like something that had been inevitable from the moment she'd walked through his gates. I'll marry you, Salvatore. Something shifted in his expression, satisfaction mixed with something that looked almost like relief. Then we have considerable work ahead of us, he said, standing, extending his hand the way he had 3 days earlier. A wedding to plan, a cathedral to walk into, and a son who has no idea what's about to walk through those doors beside me. Luciana shook his hand, steady this time in a way that felt entirely different from their first meeting. He'll find out soon enough, she said. Every villain in this story eventually does. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out, which gave Luciana exactly 6 weeks to become someone the underworld would respect on sight, because respect earned slowly was a luxury she no longer had time for. Salvatore assigned her a woman named Renata for the transformation, a stylist who'd apparently dressed 3 generations of syndicate wives and knew, better than anyone alive, the difference between looking wealthy and looking untouchable. Most women who walk into rooms like the ones you're about to enter, Renata said, circling Luciana with a measuring tape and an expression of professional scrutiny, make the mistake of dressing to be liked. That's the wrong goal entirely. What's the right one? Luciana asked. You dress to be believed. Renata pinned a swatch of fabric against her shoulder, deep green shot through with gold thread that caught the light like something alive. The moment you walk into that cathedral, every person present is going to be deciding, in about 4 seconds, whether you belong there. Your dress does half that work before you ever open your mouth. Luciana studied herself in the mirror, watching the fabric drape against her skin, and felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with vanity. Emerald, she said slowly. Julian's bride will be in white, Renata said, not looking up from her pinning. Traditional, expected, forgettable within the hour. You are not going to blend into anyone's expectations of what a bride looks like, because you're not attending as a bride in the way that room understands the word. You're attending as a statement. Salvatore's wife. Salvatore's queen, Renata corrected, meeting her eyes in the mirror. There's a difference, and by the time we're finished, everyone in that cathedral will understand it. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm Luciana hadn't expected to find herself enjoying. Fittings in the morning, strategy sessions with Salvatore in the afternoon, and slowly, gradually, something resembling an actual partnership beginning to take shape between them. "You're quiet today," Salvatore observed one afternoon, watching her from across his study as she reviewed shipping ledgers he'd started sharing with her, without being asked, an unspoken acknowledgement that her seat at the table was already more than symbolic. "I'm thinking about Alessandra," Luciana admitted. "The bride. She has no idea what she's walking into." Luciana set the ledger down. "Julian used her family's connections the same way he used 2 years of my life. As a tool, nothing more. She's about to marry a man who sees her as leverage, and she doesn't even know it. You feel sorry for her?" "I feel something," Luciana said carefully. "I'm not certain sorry is the correct word for it. Recognition, maybe. I know exactly what it looks like from the inside, being someone's convenient plan instead of someone's genuine choice." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his weathered face. "Is that what you believe this is? What we're building?" "I believe it started that way," Luciana said honestly, because honesty seemed to be the one currency that actually mattered between them. "I'm no longer entirely certain it's staying that way." Something shifted in his expression, quiet and unhurried, the same careful assessment he'd given her the very first day, except warmer now, less clinical. "Neither am I," he said simply, and returned to his own paperwork before the moment could stretch into something either of them wasn't yet prepared to name. 3 days before the wedding, Renata delivered the finished gown, and Luciana understood immediately why the woman had insisted on emerald from the very first fitting. The dress fell backless, a deliberate architectural choice that turned vulnerability into a weapon, gold embroidery climbing the fabric like something growing rather than stitched, dark and rich enough to look black in low light, and impossibly vivid in candlelight. Exactly the kind of dress designed to dominate a room lit by chandeliers and stained glass. "You'll wear your hair down," Renata instructed, arranging Luciana's dark curls over one bare shoulder. "Julian's bride will have hers pinned up, formal, controlled. Yours stays wild. It tells the room you answer to nobody's idea of what you should look like." "You've clearly done this before," Luciana said, watching the transformation continue in the mirror. "Twice," Renata said. "Both women are still alive and still respected, which in this world counts as a resounding success rate. Follow my instructions, and you'll make it 3. The night before the wedding, Salvatore found her standing on the estate's terrace, staring out at grounds lit by more security lighting than most small towns possessed. "Second thoughts?" he asked, joining her at the railing. "Not about marrying you," Luciana said. "About what happens after. Julian isn't going to simply accept losing everything without retaliating. Men like him never do." "No," Salvatore agreed grimly. "He won't. Which is precisely why we're not simply announcing this quietly through legal channels. We're walking into that cathedral in front of every family who matters, because the moment they see us together, any move Julian tries to make afterward becomes a move against both of us, publicly, undeniably. It removes any question of who actually holds power in this family. And if Vasquez decides to protect his daughter's interests by protecting Julian's ambitions, then we'll have exactly the confirmation we need that the Vasquez family was never interested in a wedding at all," Salvatore said. "Only in the access that wedding provided them into my organization." Luciana turned to face him fully. "You're certain about this?" "I've survived 30 years in this life by being certain about very little and prepared for everything," Salvatore said. "But I'm certain about one thing tonight." "What's that?" "That 6 weeks ago, a woman walked into my office with evidence that could have destroyed my entire organization, and instead of using it against me, she chose to build something with me instead." His voice had lowered, quieter than she'd heard it before, stripped of the careful business tone he usually maintained. "I've spent 30 years surrounded by people who wanted something from me. You're the first one in longer than I care to admit who seemed interested in building something alongside me instead. Luciana felt something warm settle in her chest, unexpected and slightly unwelcome, given how carefully she'd guarded against exactly this kind of feeling since Julian's betrayal. "Careful, Salvatore," she said softly. That almost sounded like affection. "Perhaps it was," he said, and for the first time since she'd met him, something like a genuine smile crossed his face. "Tomorrow, you become my wife in front of everyone who matters in this world. Tonight, I simply wanted you to know that whatever this arrangement started as, I no longer think of it that way." Luciana didn't have a response ready for that, which was rare enough that she simply let the silence sit between them, comfortable in a way she hadn't expected an arrangement like this one to ever become. Morning arrived faster than she was prepared for. Renata worked in near silence, focused entirely on the details, fastening the emerald gown, arranging Luciana's curls exactly as planned, adding gold jewelry that caught the morning light streaming through the estate's windows. "Last piece," Renata said, holding up a pair of earrings that had clearly cost more than most people's cars. "These belong to Salvatore's mother. He asked me to give them to you this morning." Luciana took them carefully, feeling the weight of what they represented settle over her, generations of a family she was about to become permanently woven into. "He didn't mention this," she said. "He wanted it to be a surprise." Renata helped her fasten them, stepping back to survey the finished result with clear satisfaction. "There, look at yourself." Luciana turned to the mirror, and for a long moment, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the discarded fiancé who'd sat alone with an untouched glass of wine 6 weeks earlier. In her place stood someone forged from that same pain into something considerably sharper, considerably more dangerous. "Ready?" Renata asked. Before Luciana could answer, a knock sounded at the door, and Salvatore's voice carried through it, steady and unhurried, despite what was waiting for them both across town. "The car is ready," he said. "It's time." Luciana took one last look at herself in the mirror, at the emerald silk and gold thread, at the woman Julian had never bothered to truly see. She smoothed the fabric once, drew a breath, and reached for the door. Whatever waited inside that cathedral, whatever expression crossed Julian's face the moment he realized exactly who was walking up that aisle beside his father, she intended to remember every second of it. She'd waited 6 weeks for this entrance. She had absolutely no intention of letting anyone, least of all Julian, take it from her now. The cathedral came into view exactly as the sun began slipping behind its spires, gold light catching stained glass windows that had probably witnessed 100 years of syndicate weddings before this one. Luciana sat beside Salvatore in the back of the car, hands folded in her lap, watching the building grow larger through the tinted window. "Nervous?" Salvatore asked, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the same view. "No," Luciana said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was true. "I spent 6 weeks being nervous. I think I've run out." "Good." He finally turned to look at her, something like pride crossing his weathered face. "You'll need every bit of steadiness you have left for the next hour." The car slowed to a stop at the base of the cathedral steps, and through the window, Luciana could see the last of the guests filing inside. Men in dark suits, women in jewelry that cost more than most annual salaries, all of them entirely unaware of what was about to walk through those doors behind them. "They're already seated," the driver confirmed quietly. Salvatore nodded once, then turned back to Luciana. "Once we walk through those doors, there's no version of this where we simply turn around. You understand that?" "I've understood that since the moment I agreed to marry you," Luciana said. "I'm not walking in there to make a statement, Salvatore. I'm walking in there to make it permanent." Something fierce and satisfied crossed his face at that. He extended his hand. "Then let's give my son the wedding gift he actually deserves." The cathedral doors opened just as the priest reached the question every ceremony holds its breath for, the one about objections, about reasons 2 people shouldn't be joined. Nobody was supposed to actually answer it. Luciana walked in first, emerald silk catching the candlelight, gold thread shimmering with every deliberate step. her dark curls loose over one bare shoulder exactly as Renata had arranged them. Beside her, Salvatore's hand closed around hers, steady, unhurried, radiating the particular calm of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to command a room. The congregation turned as one, the collective gasp audible even over the organ music still trailing off into confused silence. At the altar, Julian turned first. Whatever composure he'd built for this ceremony evaporated the instant he registered who was walking toward him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, no sound emerging from any of it. Beside him, Alessandra turned next, veil trembling as she took in the scene, confusion giving way to something sharper as her eyes moved from Salvatore's face to Luciana's dress, to the way their hands remained locked together. "Father," Julian finally managed, voice cracking slightly on the single word, "what is this?" "A wedding, obviously," Salvatore said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the cathedral, pitched exactly loud enough for every guest present to hear clearly. "Though I confess, not the one currently scheduled for this altar." "You can't be serious." Julian's eyes were wide, darting between his father and Luciana, with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. "You're standing here, in the middle of my wedding, holding hands with my ex-fiancé." "Your former fiancé," Salvatore corrected calmly, "who you discarded quite publicly, if memory serves, in favor of this alliance. I simply saw no reason to let such an intelligent, capable woman go entirely to waste." A murmur rippled through the pews, low and immediate, guests leaning toward one another, with expressions ranging from scandal to poorly concealed delight. Weddings like this one rarely offered entertainment beyond the ceremony itself. "This is insane," Julian said, color rising in his face. "You expect me to believe this is real? That you're actually married?" Salvatore finished for him. 3 days ago, in a private ceremony witnessed by counsel from 4 different families, all of whom can confirm its legitimacy, should anyone present feel inclined to question it. Alessandra's father, Enrico Vasquez, rose from the front pew, his expression carefully neutral in the way powerful men trained themselves to remain when caught entirely off guard. "Salvatore," he said, voice measured, "this is a rather unconventional way to announce a marriage." "I've found conventional announcements rarely make the necessary point," Salvatore replied smoothly. "And there is, admittedly, a point that needed making today." "Which is?" Salvatore's gaze swept the cathedral slowly, taking in every family, every ally, every rival who'd gathered to witness what they'd believed would be Julian's rise into greater power. "That my organization remains firmly under my control," he said, "and that any arrangements built on the assumption otherwise were built on very unstable ground." Julian's face had gone from red to something closer to ash. "You did this to humiliate me." "I did this to correct a miscalculation," Salvatore said, and for the first time, real steel entered his voice, the kind that made several guests in the nearby pews visibly straighten. "You spent the last year diverting shipping contracts to Enrico's operations through a shell company you assumed I'd never discover. You were preparing to inherit an empire you were simultaneously selling to the man sitting in your front row. That's not ambition, Julian. That's treason wearing a nice suit." The gasp that moved through the cathedral this time was considerably louder. "That's a lie," Julian said, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction, thinning into something closer to panic. "It's documented," Luciana said, speaking for the first time since walking through those doors, her voice calm and clear enough to carry to every corner of the cathedral. "Freight manifests, banking records. A shell company registered 8 months before your engagement was even announced, 40% owned by Alessandra's father. I found it because you talked too freely in front of a woman you assumed had stopped listening the moment you broke off our engagement." Every eye in the cathedral swung toward her now, weighing her, measuring her, recalculating exactly who she was and what she represented. "You," Julian said, staring at her like he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. "You did this. You went to my father." "I went to your father because you handed me every reason to." Luciana said evenly. You told me love doesn't build empires, that strategic families do. I simply took your advice and built something considerably more strategic than you managed. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the congregation, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape notice. Enrico Vasquez had gone very still, calculating something behind carefully controlled features. Salvatore, if these accusations are accurate, I assure you I had no knowledge of any arrangement between my daughter's fiancé and my own holdings. Perhaps, Salvatore said, in a tone that suggested he believed exactly none of it. We can discuss that particular claim in considerably more private circumstances. Today, however, is simply about clarity. My organization has a new administrator standing beside me, one who will be assuming considerably more authority over our operations moving forward, effective immediately. You can't just replace me, Julian said, desperation cracking through his earlier bravado. I'm your son. You're my son, Salvatore agreed, something almost sad passing behind his eyes for the briefest moment before hardening again. That fact hasn't changed, and never will. But sons who conspire against their fathers don't inherit thrones, Julian. They lose the privilege of ever being trusted with one. Alessandra, silent until now, finally found her voice, though it came out thin and unsteady. Julian, is any of this true? Julian didn't answer, which answered everything anyone in that cathedral needed to know. Luciana watched Alessandra's face crumble in real time, watched the young woman realize, in front of hundreds of witnesses, exactly what kind of arrangement she'd actually walked into. Something in Luciana's chest twisted at the sight, recognition rather than satisfaction, the particular ache of watching someone else discover the same betrayal she'd survived months earlier. For what it's worth, Luciana said quietly, meeting Alessandra's stricken eyes, you deserved better than being used as leverage. I understand exactly how that feels. Alessandra said nothing, but something in her expression shifted, and Luciana suspected this wedding was ending regardless of anything Salvatore or Julian had planned. Salvatore turned to address the cathedral fully now, his voice carrying with the effortless authority of a man who'd spent 30 years being obeyed without ever needing to shout. I apologize for disrupting what was meant to be a celebration, he said, though nothing in his tone suggested genuine apology. But every family present deserves clarity regarding where true authority in this organization currently resides. It resides with me, and as of 3 days ago, with my wife standing beside me. Anyone with concerns about that arrangement is welcome to address them directly, though I'd advise choosing your words carefully. Silence settled over the cathedral, thick and absolute, broken only by the quiet sound of Alessandra removing her veil with trembling hands, letting it fall to the marble floor. Julian stood frozen at the altar, staring at the woman he'd once dismissed as insufficiently ambitious, now standing beside his father as the most powerful woman in the entire room. Luciana held his gaze steadily, unflinching, letting him see exactly what he'd thrown away. You said I wasn't enough to matter in your world, she said softly, just for him, though the silence of the cathedral carried her words to every ear present anyway. It seems you were simply looking at the wrong throne. The reception hall had been decorated for a celebration that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. White roses and gold ribbon arranged across tables meant to host a marriage that had effectively ended the moment Salvatore walked through those cathedral doors. Nobody left, though. Curiosity, Luciana had come to understand over the past 6 weeks, was a considerably stronger force in this world than propriety. Every guest who'd witnessed the cathedral standoff filed into the reception hall anyway, whispering behind champagne glasses, watching to see whether the evening's drama had concluded or merely paused for a change of venue. It had merely paused. Salvatore guided Luciana to the head table, the one clearly meant for Julian and Alessandra, and settled into the seat with the unhurried confidence of a man reclaiming territory that had always belonged to him. You're certain about this? Luciana murmured, taking the seat beside him. Staying for the reception. It feels like pressing a wound that hasn't finished bleeding. That's precisely the point, Salvatore said quietly. Wounds that don't finish bleeding in front of witnesses tend to fester in private instead, and private wounds are far more dangerous to an organization than public ones. Better everyone sees exactly how this ends tonight. Julian arrived a few minutes later, Alessandra trailing behind him with an expression that had hardened considerably since the cathedral, grief giving way to something colder, more calculating. They approached the head table because there was nowhere else in the room that made sense for them to go. Every other seat already understood by the assembled guests to belong to someone else now. "You're sitting in my chair," Julian said, stopping in front of the table, voice tight with barely restrained fury. "Your chair," Salvatore repeated mildly. "I don't recall gifting you a chair, Julian. I recall gifting you an opportunity, which you spent the last year quietly selling to Enrico Vasquez. This is still my wedding." "Was," Luciana corrected. Past tense feels considerably more accurate at this point. Wouldn't you agree? Alessandra's jaw tightened. "You have some nerve, showing up here in that dress, acting like you belong in this family." "I do belong in this family," Luciana said evenly. "That happens to be the entire point of a marriage certificate. Perhaps you should ask Julian to explain the concept to you, given he seems to understand contracts better than commitments." A few guests within earshot didn't bother hiding their laughter this time, and Alessandra's face flushed with humiliation sharp enough to make her flinch. "You think this is funny?" Alessandra snapped, turning her attention fully on Luciana now. "You think crashing my wedding, humiliating me in front of everyone I know, makes you some kind of victor?" "I think," Luciana said, setting down her champagne glass with deliberate calm, "that you're angry at the wrong person. I didn't build a shell company to funnel your father's money out from under Salvatore. I didn't spend a year planning a wedding as cover for a hostile takeover. Julian did that. I simply refused to let him get away with it. My father wouldn't participate in something so underhanded." "Your father owns 40% of a company that doesn't officially exist," Luciana said. "I'd suggest asking him directly, except he seems to have found somewhere else to be for the last 10 minutes. Alessandra's eyes darted toward the door, and indeed, Enrico Vasquez was nowhere in sight, having apparently decided that distance from this particular conversation served his interests considerably better than presence. "He's protecting the family," Julian said quickly, though the conviction in his voice had thinned noticeably. "He's protecting himself," Salvatore corrected. "There's a meaningful difference, Julian, one I'd have hoped you'd learn by now, given how thoroughly you've been taught it tonight." Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You humiliated me in front of everyone who matters in this business. My own father. You humiliated yourself the moment you decided betraying your own family was an acceptable business strategy," Salvatore said, voice hardening now, all pretense of civility dropping away. "I simply made certain everyone understood exactly what you'd done, rather than allowing you to inherit an empire you'd already begun selling off piece by piece." "So what happens now?" Julian demanded. "You just parade your new wife around while I stand here and take it?" "Now," Salvatore said, rising slowly from his chair, drawing every eye in the reception hall toward him, "you understand your position moving forward. You remain my son, and I won't pretend that fact means nothing to me, regardless of what you've done. But you no longer hold any claim to authority within this organization. Every decision, every contract, every operation runs through Luciana and myself from this point forward. You're disowning me. I'm correcting a mistake," Salvatore said. "One I should have caught considerably earlier." Julian turned to Luciana, then, something desperate entering his expression, the particular panic of a man watching every advantage slip away in real time. "You did this. You destroyed everything I built." "You didn't build anything," Luciana said, standing now as well, meeting him at eye level, despite the height difference her heels couldn't fully close. "You inherited a position. You were actively selling out from under the man who gave it to you. I simply made sure the people who actually matter in this world understood exactly what kind of man you are before you finished the betrayal." "I gave you 2 years," Julian said, voice cracking with something that might have been genuine regret, buried somewhere beneath the wounded pride. "And this is how you repay that? You gave me 2 years and then discarded me in a restaurant because I wasn't useful enough to your ambitions," Luciana replied, steady, unflinching. "I'm not repaying anything, Julian. I'm simply demonstrating, quite thoroughly, exactly how badly you miscalculated my worth." The reception hall had gone almost entirely silent now, every guest watching the exchange with the rapt attention of people witnessing history rearrange itself in real time. Alessandra stepped forward, chin raised despite the humiliation still visibly burning beneath her composure. This doesn't change anything for me and Julian. We're still married. That's not something either of you can simply erase with a dramatic entrance. Nobody's trying to erase your marriage, Salvatore said calmly. You're welcome to remain married to my son for as long as you'd like. I'd simply advise adjusting your expectations regarding what that marriage actually grants you. Moving forward. Julian's inheritance ends tonight. Whatever life you build together, you'll be building it without access to this family's resources. Alessandra's composure finally cracked at that, real fear flickering behind her eyes for the first time since the cathedral. You can't be serious! I assure you, I've never been more serious in my life, Salvatore said. Perhaps you should have that conversation with your father about exactly what he knew and exactly why he encouraged this marriage in the first place. I suspect the answers might surprise you considerably less than you'd hope. Luciana watched Alessandra's face shift through several stages of dawning horror and felt that same uncomfortable flicker of recognition she'd felt in the cathedral, watching another woman discover, publicly and humiliatingly, exactly how disposable she'd been to the men around her. For what it's worth, Luciana said quietly, I'd suggest you and I have very little reason to remain enemies in this. We were both used by the same ambitions, just from different angles. I don't need your sympathy, Alessandra said, though her voice lacked its earlier venom. It's not sympathy, Luciana said. It's an observation. Julian used you exactly the same way he used me, just with better timing on his part. Whatever anger you're carrying right now, I'd suggest aiming it at the man actually responsible for it. Julian's face had gone pale, watching the two women he'd manipulated exchange something that looked dangerously close to mutual understanding. This isn't over, he said, though the threat carried considerably less weight than he clearly intended. No, Salvatore agreed, settling back into his chair with the calm finality of a man who'd already won whatever war his son believed was still being fought. It isn't, but the terms have changed considerably, and I'd suggest you take tonight to understand exactly how much. He raised his glass toward the stunned reception hall, toward guests still processing exactly what they'd witnessed, toward rival families already recalculating alliances in real time. To new beginnings, Salvatore said, his eyes finding Luciana's, something warm and genuine passing between them despite the coldness of everything surrounding it. And to the woman standing beside me, who understood the true value of this family before anyone else, including my own son, ever bothered to look. Luciana raised her glass to meet his, and somewhere across the room, she watched Julian turn away first, unable to hold her gaze any longer. She'd spent 6 weeks building toward this exact moment. Watching him finally understand exactly what he'd lost made every second of it worth the wait. 3 weeks into the marriage, Luciana discovered that running an empire looked considerably less glamorous than the cathedral entrance had suggested, and considerably more like long nights buried in ledgers with a man who apparently never slept before midnight. You don't have to stay up for this, Salvatore said one evening, not looking up from the contract he was reviewing, though something in his tone suggested he didn't entirely mean it. I do, actually, Luciana said, settling into the chair across from his desk with her own stack of documents. If I'm going to be administering half these operations, I'd rather understand them thoroughly than pretend competence I don't have. Most people in your position would simply sign whatever I put in front of them. I'm not most people, Luciana said, flipping open the first file. And you didn't marry most people either, so I'd suggest adjusting your expectations accordingly. Salvatore glanced up at that, something like amusement flickering across his face, quiet and genuine in a way that had become increasingly familiar over the past 3 weeks. No, he agreed. I certainly didn't. They worked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the occasional scratch of a pen, until Luciana came across a discrepancy in one of the shipping ledgers that made her sit up straighter. This doesn't add up, she said, sliding the document across the desk. Freight costs on the eastern route jumped nearly 30% last quarter, but the corresponding revenue barely moved. Either someone's skimming, or there's an inefficiency here nobody's caught yet. Salvatore studied the page, brow furrowing. You found this in an hour. My accountants have been reviewing these books for months. Your accountants are looking for fraud, Luciana said. I'm looking for anything that doesn't make logical sense. Sometimes those are the same thing, sometimes they're not. And this one? I'd need to see the manifests for the actual shipments before I could say for certain. She tapped the page thoughtfully. But my instinct says someone's padding invoices somewhere along that route, probably assuming nobody's paying close enough attention to notice a 30% jump instead of something more obviously suspicious. Salvatore leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between admiration and genuine surprise, the look of a man continually recalibrating his estimate of what she was capable of. You keep doing that, he said. Doing what? Finding things my own people miss. He set the ledger down. I've had accountants on payroll for over a decade who've never once flagged an inefficiency like that. They're probably not looking for it, Luciana said. Most people see numbers and check whether they balance. I see numbers and wonder what story they're actually telling, because numbers rarely lie, even when the people reporting them do. That's a dangerous skill to have in this business. I'd assume it's precisely the skill this business needs, Luciana countered, given how much of it seems to run on people assuming nobody's paying close enough attention. Salvatore's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, something warm settling behind his eyes that had nothing to do with shipping manifests or freight costs. I'll have someone pull the manifests for that route first thing tomorrow, he said finally, clearing his throat slightly. In the meantime, it's nearly midnight. You should rest. You're one to talk, Luciana said, gesturing at the stack of contracts still in front of him. You've been sitting there since before I arrived. Old habits, Salvatore admitted. I've spent 30 years believing sleep was a luxury this business rarely afforded me. That sounds exhausting. It has been, he said quietly, and something in the admission felt more honest than anything he'd told her since the day she'd walked into his office with evidence of Julian's betrayal. Considerably more exhausting, if I'm honest, before you arrived. Luciana felt something shift in her chest at that, warm and unexpected. The particular ache of realizing an arrangement she'd entered purely as strategy had somehow become something she genuinely looked forward to each evening. Salvatore, she said slowly, can I ask you something? Always. Do you regret this? The marriage, I mean? Not the alliance itself, but actually being married to someone you barely knew when you proposed it. Salvatore considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, weighing his answer before offering it. I regret very little in my life, he said finally. But I've come to realize, over these past few weeks, that I regret not asking you sooner what you actually wanted from this arrangement, beyond the practical necessities we discussed that first evening. What I want, Luciana repeated softly. You walked into my life carrying a betrayal I imagine still aches, regardless of how thoroughly you've avenged it, Salvatore said. I offered you power, position, a seat at a table you'd earned through your own intelligence. I never once asked whether that was actually enough for you, or whether you wanted something more than a business arrangement dressed up in a marriage certificate. Luciana felt her breath catch slightly, unprepared for the vulnerability suddenly present in his voice, so different from the controlled authority he wielded in every other context she'd witnessed. I didn't know I wanted more, she admitted quietly, until considerably more recently than I'd like to admit. Something shifted in Salvatore's expression at that, careful hope replacing the earlier vulnerability. And now? Now, Luciana said, setting down the ledger in her lap. I think I've spent 3 weeks convincing myself this was purely strategic, purely practical, because admitting otherwise felt considerably more dangerous than facing down an entire cathedral full of rival families. Dangerous how? Julian taught me that trusting someone with my future ends in humiliation, Luciana said. I'm not entirely certain I know how to risk that twice. Salvatore rose from his desk slowly, rounding it to stand closer to her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his gaze. "I'm not Julian," he said quietly. "I won't insult either of us by promising I'm without flaws, because 30 years in this life have given me considerably more than most men carry. But I can promise you this: whatever grows between us, I have no intention of discarding it the moment something more convenient presents itself." Luciana stood as well, close enough now that she could see the careful restraint in his expression. A man who'd spent decades commanding rooms through sheer force of presence, suddenly uncertain in a way that felt entirely new to both of them. "That's a considerable promise," she said softly. "I don't make promises I can't keep," Salvatore said. "It's precisely why I've made so few of them in my life." The space between them had narrowed without either of them quite deciding to close it, and Luciana found herself acutely aware of exactly how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him despite the careful distance they'd maintained for 3 weeks. "Salvatore," she said, his name barely more than a breath. "Luciana." His voice had roughened slightly, the careful control fraying at the edges. "If this changes," she said slowly, "if this becomes something beyond strategy, I need you to understand something first." "Tell me." "I won't survive being discarded twice," she said, the admission costing her something visible, a vulnerability she'd guarded carefully since that restaurant conversation months earlier. "If we do this, if we let this become real, you need to be certain, because I don't have room left in me for another man who sees me as convenient rather than necessary." Salvatore reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and when she didn't, his hand settled gently against her cheek, warm and steady. "You are not convenient, Luciana," he said, voice low and certain. "You walked into my office and handed me evidence that could have destroyed everything I'd built, and instead of using that leverage against me, you chose to build something alongside me instead. That's not convenience. That's the rarest kind of loyalty I've encountered in 30 years of this business, and I have no intention of ever treating it, or you, as anything less than exactly what you are." "Which is?" "Necessary," he said simply. "Irreplaceable. Mine, if you'll have me, not as a business arrangement, but as something considerably more dangerous to both our carefully guarded hearts." Luciana felt something break loose in her chest, some final wall she'd built after Julian's betrayal finally giving way, and she closed the remaining distance between them before either of them could second-guess the decision. The kiss that followed carried none of the careful calculation that had defined every other moment of their arrangement. Nothing strategic or practical about the way his hands found her waist or the way she leaned into him without hesitation. 6 weeks of careful distance, dissolving into something neither of them had planned for, but both of them had clearly wanted. When they finally broke apart, Salvatore rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteady, in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar coming from a man usually so composed. "Well," he said, something like wonder threading through his voice. "That complicates our business arrangement considerably." Luciana laughed softly, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I believe it does." "Any regrets?" "Only that it took us 3 weeks to admit it," she said, and pulled him back toward her before he could answer. Neither of them noticed the shadow shifting outside the study window, nor the careful footsteps retreating down the hallway, someone who'd seen considerably more than they were meant to witness that evening. Someone who understood exactly how valuable that information might prove to certain interested parties, should the right price be offered for it. The eavesdropper's name was Marco, and Luciana learned this only because he made the mistake of underestimating exactly how thoroughly she'd learned to read people since walking into Salvatore's office 3 months earlier. She noticed him first at breakfast, 2 days after that night in the study, lingering near the kitchen doorway a fraction too long, while she and Salvatore discussed the morning schedule. She noticed him again outside the estate's east wing, ostensibly checking a security panel that hadn't malfunctioned in months. By the third sighting, she'd stopped believing in coincidence entirely. "Something troubling you?" Salvatore asked over coffee, catching the way her eyes tracked Marco's retreat down the hallway. "Probably nothing," Luciana said carefully, not wanting to raise an alarm built on instinct alone. "How long has Marco worked security here?" 2 years, maybe 3. Why? No reason yet, she said. Just an itch I'd like to scratch quietly, if you don't mind giving me some room to investigate. Salvatore studied her for a moment, then nodded, trusting the instinct that had already proven itself considerably more valuable than any accountant on his payroll. Quietly, he agreed. Tell me the moment it becomes something. It became something 4 days later. Luciana had taken to reviewing the estate's phone records as part of her broader effort to understand the organization's internal communications, a task nobody had specifically assigned her, but one she deemed necessary regardless. Buried in 3 weeks of unremarkable calls, one number appeared with a frequency that caught her attention immediately. Always placed late at night, always lasting less than 90 seconds. The pattern of someone being extremely careful about being noticed. She traced the number through a contact she'd cultivated at the phone company, the kind of favor that cost considerably more than money, but proved worth every bit of it. The number belonged to Julian. Luciana sat with that information for a long moment, feeling something cold settle over her. Not surprise exactly, but confirmation of a suspicion she hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge until now. She brought it to Salvatore that evening, laying the phone records across his desk, the same way she'd once laid evidence of Julian's shipping fraud. Marco's been in contact with your son, she said. Late at night, brief calls, going back at least 3 weeks. Since roughly the time we first became, she paused, searching for the right word. Involved? Salvatore finished quietly, studying the records with a hardening expression. Since roughly then, yes. You think he's been watching us? I think he saw something the night we finally admitted what was growing between us, Luciana said. And I think he's been reporting details back to Julian ever since. Salvatore's jaw tightened, the careful calm he usually maintained fraying at the edges. If Julian knows about us, about how quickly this arrangement became genuine, he'll use it. He'll frame it as weakness, as proof I've grown soft, distracted by feelings I shouldn't be indulging. There's more, Luciana said, and something in her voice made Salvatore look up sharply. I had my contact check where else that number's been calling. It's not just Marco reporting to Julian. Who else? There's a third number in the pattern, Luciana said, registered to a private line out of the Vasquez estate. Julian's been talking to Enrico directly, well after the wedding disaster, well after Enrico supposedly distanced himself from the whole arrangement. Salvatore's expression went very still, the particular stillness of a man calculating threat levels with practiced precision. They're planning something. I'd stake my life on it, Luciana said. The question is what, and I don't think we'll get that answer from phone records alone. The answer came 3 nights later, and it came from Marco himself, though not by choice. Luciana had arranged, through careful and deliberately obvious means, to be alone in the estate's east wing that evening, ostensibly reviewing files in a room she rarely used, the kind of vulnerability designed to look accidental while being anything but. Marco appeared within the hour, exactly as she'd calculated he would, slipping into the room under the pretense of a routine security check. Everything all right in here, Mrs. Salvatore? He asked, his eyes doing a quick, practiced sweep of the room that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with information gathering. Actually, Marco, I'm glad you stopped by, Luciana said pleasantly, not looking up from her files. I've been meaning to ask you something. Of course, anything. How long have you been reporting my conversations to Julian? The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to confirm everything she needed to know. I don't know what you're talking about, Marco said, too quickly, his composure cracking at the edges. 3 weeks of late-night calls, Marco. 90 seconds each, give or take. I have the records, and I have the number they were placed to, which happens to belong to a man who lost every reason to remain loyal to this family the moment his father discovered his betrayal. Luciana finally looked up, meeting his eyes steadily. You have exactly one opportunity right now to tell me the truth. I'd encourage you to take it, because the alternative involves Salvatore learning about this himself, and I promise you, his patience for traitors is considerably thinner than mine. Marco's face went pale, calculation flickering behind his eyes as he weighed his remaining options, and found all of them equally unappealing. "They're not just talking," he said finally, voice dropping to something closer to a whisper. "Julian and Enrico. They've been planning something bigger than surveillance. Tell me." "There's a shipment coming through the eastern route next week," Marco said. "The one you flagged, the discrepancy in the freight costs. It wasn't an accounting error. Julian's been using that route to smuggle something for Enrico, and they're planning to make sure the entire operation gets traced back to Salvatore if anyone official ever comes asking questions." Luciana felt her pulse quicken, pieces sliding into place with uncomfortable clarity. "What exactly are they smuggling?" "I don't know all the details," Marco admitted. "Weapons, I think, moving through legitimate freight to avoid inspection. But that's not even the worst part." "What's the worst part?" "They know about you and Salvatore," Marco said, unable to meet her eyes now. "About the marriage becoming real instead of just strategic. Julian's planning to use that, to frame it publicly as proof his father's judgment can't be trusted anymore, that he's making decisions based on infatuation instead of leadership. He wants to use the smuggling operation as evidence, timed perfectly to coincide with exposing your relationship, to make it look like Salvatore's too distracted to notice criminal activity happening under his own roof." Luciana absorbed that slowly, understanding now exactly how carefully Julian had constructed this, using her own happiness as ammunition against the very man who'd given her a place in this world. "When?" she asked. "When is this supposed to happen?" "The shipment arrives Thursday," Marco said. "I believe the plan is to have authorities intercept it publicly, timed alongside some kind of announcement about you and Salvatore. I don't know all the specifics. I swear it. I was only ever asked to report on your movements, nothing more." "You were asked to help destroy this family from the inside," Luciana corrected coldly. "I'd suggest you remember that distinction the next time you consider where your loyalty actually belongs." She rose from her chair, already calculating the next several moves required to dismantle whatever Julian believed he'd constructed. "You're not going anywhere tonight, Marco," she said. "Not until Salvatore decides exactly what happens to men who sell out the family that's employed them for 3 years. Marco's face had gone the color of old paper. "Please, Mrs. Salvatore, I never wanted." "What you wanted stopped mattering the moment you picked up that phone," Luciana said, already moving toward the door, already composing the conversation she needed to have with Salvatore within the next few minutes. "Now the only thing that matters is whether you're useful enough to keep breathing past tonight." She left him standing there, pale and shaking, and made her way through the estate's corridors with a calm she didn't entirely feel, already running through every possible countermeasure against a trap 3 months in the making. Julian wanted to frame their relationship as weakness. He was about to discover that the same relationship he intended to weaponize was precisely the reason his entire plot was about to collapse before it ever reached Thursday. Salvatore listened to Marco's confession in near silence, and when Luciana finished recounting every detail, he sat back in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who'd already begun rearranging an entire battlefield in his mind. "Thursday," he said finally. 4 days from now." "Enough time to prepare, if we move carefully," Luciana said. "Not enough time for them to notice we know. What do you propose?" "We let the shipment arrive exactly as scheduled," Luciana said, pacing slowly in front of his desk, the plan sharpening with every step. "Julian wants authorities to intercept it publicly, timed alongside exposing our relationship. Fine. We simply make certain the authorities find something considerably different than what Julian's expecting them to find." Salvatore's eyes narrowed with interest. "Go on." "You still control that route legally, on paper, regardless of what Julian's been smuggling through it," Luciana said. "We quietly replace the weapons shipment before Thursday, document everything Julian and Enrico have done, and make sure that when authorities arrive, they find evidence of Julian's crimes instead of yours. Every ounce of exposure he's engineered gets redirected straight back at him. That requires access to the shipment before Thursday," Salvatore said, "which means intercepting it ourselves, quietly, without alerting either Julian or Enrico that we know anything." "Marco can help with that," Luciana said, assuming he wants any chance at surviving what he's already done. "Marco, Given the stark alternative Salvatore outlined for him in considerably fewer words than Luciana had used, agreed to cooperate without hesitation. By Wednesday night, the Eastern Route shipment had been quietly intercepted, its contents documented in exhaustive detail by men loyal only to Salvatore, then replaced with cargo manifests that would withstand any scrutiny authorities cared to apply. The weapons themselves, along with photographic evidence connecting them directly to Julian and Enrico's shell company, sat locked in Salvatore's private safe, waiting for exactly the right moment to surface. "Thursday's going to be a very long day for my son," Salvatore observed, reviewing the evidence one final time. "It's going to be a very long day for all of us," Luciana said, "but considerably longer for the two men who thought they could weaponize our happiness against us." Thursday arrived with the particular tension of a storm no one but 3 people knew was coming. Julian appeared at the estate uninvited around noon, Enrico Vasquez trailing behind him, both men wearing the careful confidence of individuals who believed they held every advantage in the coming confrontation. "Father," Julian said, finding Salvatore and Luciana in the study, "I think we need to discuss what's about to happen this afternoon." "Do we?" Salvatore said mildly, not looking up from the documents on his desk. "I wasn't aware anything significant was scheduled for today." "Don't play games," Julian snapped. "I know about the shipment on the eastern route. I know authorities are already positioned to intercept it, and when they do, everyone's going to learn exactly what's been running through your organization's freight lines." "How fascinating," Salvatore said, finally glancing up. "And what exactly do you expect them to find?" Something flickered across Julian's face, the first hint of uncertainty in an otherwise carefully rehearsed performance. "Weapons," he said. "Smuggled through your shipping contracts, evidence that'll destroy whatever reputation you've spent 30 years building." "Interesting theory," Luciana said, rising from her chair. "Except the shipment authorities intercept this afternoon won't contain a single weapon." Enrico's composure cracked slightly. "What are you talking about?" "We've known about your arrangement for 4 days," Luciana said. "The weapons you and Julian have been running through that shell company, the plan to have it publicly exposed today, alongside some announcement about my marriage to Salvatore. We simply removed the weapons before authorities arrived and replaced them with evidence considerably more damaging to the two of you than anything you'd prepared for us." Julian's face drained of color entirely. "You're lying. Check your phone," Salvatore said calmly, glancing at his watch. "I'd imagine authorities are arriving at that shipment right about now." As if summoned by the observation itself, Julian's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. He answered with visibly trembling hands, and Luciana watched the color drain further from his face with every word he heard on the other end. "That's impossible," he finally said into the phone, voice cracking. "There's been some mistake." He lowered the phone slowly, staring at his father with the particular horror of a man watching his final advantage evaporate in real time. "They found documentation," he said hollowly. "Everything. The shell company, the shipping manifests, banking records connecting straight to Enrico's accounts." Enrico's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely. "You planted this." "We simply organized what your own carelessness left behind," Luciana said. "Julian talked too freely once, months ago, about a shell company he assumed I'd never trace. You should have taught him better discretion before involving him in something this significant." "This is entrapment," Enrico said, backing toward the door. "It's consequences," Salvatore corrected, voice hardening now, all pretense of calm dropping away entirely. "You conspired with my son to smuggle weapons through my organization's legitimate shipping routes, intending to have it exposed publicly to destroy everything I've built. I simply ensured the exposure landed on the men actually responsible." Enrico didn't wait for further conversation, turning and fleeing the study with considerably less dignity than he'd arrived with, already reaching for his own phone, presumably to salvage whatever remained of his own organization's reputation before authorities came looking for him specifically. That left Julian standing alone, facing his father and the woman he'd once called insufficiently ambitious, watching the last of his leverage crumble entirely. "You destroyed me," Julian said quietly. "Both of you." You destroyed yourself, Salvatore said, rising from his desk slowly. I gave you every opportunity to build something honest with what I offered you, Julian. Instead, you chose betrayal, repeatedly, and expected it to somehow end differently than it has. What happens to me now? That depends entirely on what authorities decide to do with the evidence currently sitting in front of them, Salvatore said. I'd suggest hiring considerably better legal counsel than whatever you've relied on so far, because I have no intention of protecting you from consequences you've earned so thoroughly. Julian turned to Luciana then, something desperate and pleading in his expression. You could have simply let this go. Instead, you hunted me down, humiliated me publicly, and now you're letting authorities destroy what's left of my life. I didn't hunt you down, Julian, Luciana said evenly. You built every piece of this collapse yourself, brick by brick, starting the day you decided love mattered less than ambition. I simply refused to let you succeed at using me as a stepping stone toward destroying the very family that gave you everything. Julian had no response to that, and after a long, silent moment, he turned and walked out of the study, out of the estate, out of whatever future he'd once imagined inheriting. He didn't look back. That evening, Salvatore called together every family loyal to his organization, gathering them in the same estate hall where 6 months earlier, Luciana had first walked through his gates carrying evidence that would change both their lives permanently. Tonight, Salvatore announced to the assembled guests, marks the end of one chapter in this organization's history, and the beginning of considerably more stable ground moving forward. He turned to Luciana, standing beside him with the same steady composure she'd carried since the very first day. 6 months ago, this woman walked into my life carrying intelligence that could have destroyed everything I'd built, he continued. Instead of using it against me, she chose to build something alongside me. She's since proven, repeatedly, an intelligence and loyalty I've rarely encountered in 30 years of this business, including from my own blood. A murmur moved through the assembled guests, anticipation building with every word. Effective immediately, I'm ceding full operational control of this organization's day-to-day management to my wife, Salvatore said, and the murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. Every decision, every contract, every negotiation moving forward runs through Luciana directly. I remain here as counsel, as partner, as her husband in every sense of the word, but the authority you've all answered to for 30 years now belongs to her. Silence gripped the hall, every family present recalculating their entire understanding of where power actually resided within this world. Any objections? Salvatore asked, his gaze sweeping the room with the particular calm of a man who genuinely welcomed the challenge. Should be raised now, directly, rather than whispered later in corners, where they'll accomplish considerably less. Nobody spoke. Luciana stepped forward then, meeting the eyes of every family present, remembering the woman who'd sat alone with an untouched glass of wine 6 months earlier, believing her worth had been permanently discarded by a man too small to recognize it. I understand many of you are still uncertain what this means for your own operations, your own arrangements with this family, she said, voice carrying easily through the silent hall. I'll say only this. Loyalty built on honesty will always find protection under my leadership. Betrayal, regardless of who attempts it or how cleverly they disguise it, will find considerably less mercy than you might expect. She let that settle over the room, watching understanding dawn across dozens of faces simultaneously. Julian believed ambition mattered more than loyalty, she continued. He discovered, rather thoroughly, exactly how costly that miscalculation becomes. I'd encourage everyone in this room to learn from his example, rather than repeat it. Salvatore reached for her hand then, raising it alongside his own, and the assembled families rose as one, a slow, unmistakable gesture of recognition and submission that needed no further words to confirm. Luciana had walked into this world 6 months ago as a woman discarded, underestimated, dismissed as insufficiently ambitious to matter. Tonight, she stood as its undisputed queen, and every single person in that hall understood, without a shadow of doubt, exactly whose rule they now answered to. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story resonated with you, Please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which part of the story touched you the most, and share this video with someone who would appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.